And it's a fair question. You might be wondering why I included Peter Kalmus twice in this course. By the way, he's probably going to be coming to English 24. We already have confirmed Bill McKibben and Kim Stanley Robinson. But why we have a documentary on Peter Kalmus being the change, and now you're going to be reading from the book, if you haven't already, being the change. The reason is I think this set of readings is more akin to Project Drawdown. And we'll talk about that, because I think Project Drawdown gave us these really concrete numbers on what we as a society can do. Peter Kalmus gives us some pretty concrete information on what we as individuals can do. First, my clicker poll. I can start it. Poll. Yeah, so you may not know the answer to this. Well, you should know. You should have already watched the documentary on Peter Kalmus, and maybe you're into the reading too. I'm just curious, now that you've been introduced to him through those two ways, is he admirable? Kind of, very. Too extreme in his lifestyle choices, just plain ridiculous. I'm curious what you think. Okay. Most people, again, 1 and 2. Some people too extreme. Small group of people, kind of ridiculous. Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. But let's see what we can learn from Peter Kalmus as we continue. People are still talking. I know people, are getting a seat. Try to get here early if you can, or at least on time. Okay. Bring this over to here. Make sure that's right. So Project Drawdown, what does that do? It gives us a glimpse of the big picture, right? What we need to do to globally reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Things like I focused on educating girls and women, anyone with a uterus, providing, building things like windmills and offshore wind turbines, absolutely right. But there was a great comment someone in the class noted, and I'll read the comment here. This is referring to Project Drawdown. Most of the solutions are not things that I can do personally right now. I can't switch to wind power, solar power, nuclear power when I'm currently living on campus. I also cannot implement agricultural practices or improve my rice cultivation methods. You might remember rice cultivation is an important thing that we do globally, because the current cultivation practice of flooding the fields and all reduces a lot of methane. But, there's the problem. The Project Drawdown is great, other than, electing people, putting them into office, becoming an activist or something. How do you actually implement any of those things? You can't, even when you're living on campus, select the kind of electricity that you're getting. So Peter Kalmus, and this is why I've included him here, looks at what we can do individually to draw down our personal greenhouse gas emissions. Things like riding a bike instead of a car, eating with the climate in mind. It's true, we've been discussing these things for weeks now, but not always through the eyes of a scientist. In fact, Project Drawdown is where we really get that sort of hard scientific facts. But when we're watching something like Cowspiracy or The True Cost, what are the actual numbers there? Cowspiracy made it very clear with Kip Anderson, the person who made the film, that he's not very reliable or can't be trusted upon. Peter Kalmus is a climate scientist. He can do those same sort of calculations we saw in Project Drawdown that ranked everything in that list of 100 things. But in his case, he can do it in a personal way. So I think it's interesting to look at him for that reason. For example, he notes that when he went vegetarian in 2012, and keep in mind, Peter is like 50 now. It was later in life that he did this. It wasn't like he did it his whole life. He reduced his greenhouse gas emissions by 1,500 kilograms of CO2 per year. That's 1.5 tons, by the way. And also, we talked about being freegan. When he went freegan, he reduced his emissions by another 1,000 kilograms, or another metric ton per year. Really significant. And again, he was able to actually look at his individual footprint. And you're going to be able to do that next week in kind of a rough and ready way. And I'll explain that maybe at the very end. So as Peter Kalmus notes, vegetarianism and freeganism hence reduced his food emissions to 400 pounds of CO2. There should be pounds in there, which is 0.4 metric tons. Since he also began growing food and trading surpluses with his neighbors, presumably that number was even reduced further. So if you go back to the last slide and you look at the amount that he reduced there, 2,500 kilograms, he reduced his greenhouse gas emissions from his food system at home by 2 metric tons. A really significant number there. So if you're wondering, like, does it really make a difference if you go in a personal way? I mean, globally, less so, but does it make a difference if you go to a vegetarian? We're not talking about a hardcore vegan diet here. We're talking about a vegetarian diet. Yeah, it makes a very big difference. And the important thing is if everyone did this, it would make a huge difference. It's interesting because Peter Kalmus is not just doing this from his lab. He's actually conducting an experiment, and he's the test patient. He's seeing if it's actually possible to do this. Yeah, I mean, it's easy to say, I'll become a vegetarian, but what's it like to actually be a vegetarian? What are the larger consequences of this? Not just for climate, but for you as an individual. And he's going to walk you through that. He also does a great job, I think, of looking at the relative impact of what he's changed. So that if you think about it, it's the same thing that Project Drawdown did. Project Drawdown ranked them up, a prioritized list, starting with number one, which is food waste and switching to a largely plant-based diet. Quoting Peter Kalmus here, my 5 most effective actions were, and this I believe is in order, quitting planes, vegetarianism, bicycling, veganism, and composting. In this class, of course, we've talked about all these things, about cars, planes, animal products as a problem. But Peter Kalmus not only underscores that these are major issues, he shows how he acted on them and the results. And for him, and this is the kind of surprising thing, and this is why you can only do this personally. So in this regard, what I'm about to talk about, everyone in the room is going to be different, pretty much. And that is flying. You may not fly. If you haven't flown in years, then you obviously have 0 emissions for that. Other people may be flying more than once around the globe in the course of a year. Peter Kalmus was, as a scholar, as a climate scientist, he had to fly to conferences. It was considered part of his job to do so. And he actually calculated that, and it was just off the hook. Huge. You can read about it. Other people have done the same. People like me, professors, because it's considered part of our job. And there's a recent article about one professor who flew 100,000 miles a year to conferences. And that's just extraordinary when you think about it's many, many times more than everything else you're doing combined if you fly a lot. And again, that's something you have to think about. And we're going to actually have people in the comments thinking about that and what that would mean to not fly and what it means for things like travel and getting to see the world and all. But we'll get to that. But anyhow, these are the big ones for him. And by bicycling, he really means giving up a car and switching away from that, which again, for the average American, it's like 4,400 pounds of CO2 from driving a car. He draws attention to really little things too, and these are the things that might escape your attention. But again, as a climate scientist, he can look at them. So he moved into he lives in a little house, what you saw from the documentary, in California here, and there were 5 pilot lights that emitted a whopping 1,600 kilograms of CO2 per year. It translates into 3,500 pounds, or about a metric ton, about 1.5 metric tons. And remember, from COP21, the Paris Agreement, we should all emit no more than 2 metric tons. So this hidden thing was almost blowing his entire carbon budget. And what would these be, pilot lights? Well, you have them in appliances in your house if you have a house that has gas appliances. So if you have a gas stove, older stoves had pilot lights. Newer ones don't. They have little piezoelectric sparks that can do it. But for those older ones, it means that there's this little thing, it's about the size of a candle, burning all the time in your house to be ready whenever you lit it. It didn't used to be that way. People would actually use a match to light it. Now we have this new electronic way of igniting it. But for a big part of the 20th and into the 21st century, we had those. And your stove is one, your dryer that dries your clothes is another. Peter is probably commenting on that his stove probably had 3 pilot lights, 1 in the oven and 2 for either side of the range top. And then if you have a heater that's gas fired, it'll have a pilot light as well. And these are burning all the time, 24/7. And you think that wouldn't be a big deal, but if you actually look at it the way Peter Kalmus did, it's a really big deal. So I'm curious which reductions in particular that Peter Kalmus and his family took that interested you the most. And people will comment on that in the comments. For example, seems like a minor thing. He notes that by switching to using a clothesline, they reduced their household CO2 emissions by 550 kilograms. That one little change saves half a metric ton of CO2 or equivalent gases. And also, there's no, there's no embedded cost there either, or very little, because to produce a clothesline out of cotton or hemp or something, it takes very few resources and very few emissions. But imagine what it creates to create a clothes dryer. And it's just one of those practices everyone's gotten in, that we dry our clothes in a clothes dryer. We don't hang them outside. For all of human history, since we've been making textiles, we hung them outside. Certainly you can do it almost every day, or many, many days here in California, but it's huge. I realize not everyone can do it. If you live in an apartment, it may not be possible. It used to be that apartments included that. So you would have, even if you're up on the 5th floor, a clothesline strung over to the next building where you could pull things back, but no more. But anyhow, these things are the little things that we kind of forget about. And Peter Kalmus, very thorough guy, he thought about them all. And what's very good about his approach, and by the way, I mentioned before, and I actually have a link to it on the webpage, and then that if you want to, you can read the whole book for free. Every chapter has been made into a PDF, and it's available on his personal website. So what does it mean for diet? The average American diet is 2,900 kilograms of CO2. It's almost 3 metric tons. So if you've wondered about, could you still eat the average American diet with all its meat? Yeah, not come anywhere near meeting the Paris Agreement, because you will blow it by a metric ton, right? That amount that we all have to stay in, which is 2 metric tons, even if you did nothing else in the rest of your life, you don't fly, you don't drive, you don't do anything, just eating the wrong way with respect to the planet will completely blow your budget. Here's another eye-opening statement. And what he did is exactly what Project Drawdown did. He researched all this. And I'm quoting Peter Kalmus here. Each dollar that you spend on new stuff represents roughly 0.5 kilograms in embodied CO2 emissions. And that's counting the manufacturing, the packaging, the shipping. So continuing, as the average U.S. person spends a little over $6,000 per year on new stuff, average emissions are something like 3,000 kilograms of CO2, which translates into 3 metric tons of CO2 per Americans, and can also completely blow your carbon budget. So remember, we're trying to stay within 2 metric tons. Well, forget about food for the moment. Just think about the stuff that you buy. That's going to be about 3 metric tons. So you've blown it by a long shot just by buying stuff. And this is an interesting metric, I think, because you could look at individual things you buy. You could look at like clothing. You could look at household things you need for your kitchen, whatever you buy. And each of them are going to have individual, carbon footprints. But this basic, very back of the napkin rule of thumb averages them all together. And every time you buy something, every dollar that you spend is going to be, well, it's 0.5 kilograms. It's going to be a little over a pound of CO2. every time you buy something, regardless of what it is on average. And I realize some things are going to be less, right? When you make shopping decisions, if you buy some things that are made like of linen or hemp, it's going to be a lot less than if you buy something made of cotton or like synthetics, like polyester and all that aren't recycled. But just as a rule of thumb, every time you buy something, you are causing the emissions of CO2, pretty much a pound per dollar. And I think that's a startling thing to think about, because we're all encouraged to buy, right? You just click, and you buy. But to remember that one fact, and it's easy to figure, if you just buy something that costs $15 or $50, commensurately, there's going to be an increase. That's what's going to be with the CO2 emissions. Another startling fact that relates to us personally, and again, quoting Peter Kalmus here, U.S. landfills emit 1,300 kilograms, and that's 1.3 metric tons of CO2 per person per year in the United States. Let that sink in for a moment. Our society has reached a point where even one person's trash taken by itself generates more CO2 than the average person in Bangladesh generates for everything. So the other flip side of it, so we just saw that like every time you make a purchase, that's going to cause emissions to happen. But once we buy these things, we throw them away, and then those have emissions. A lot of it is things like methane. What that's caused by are the food that we throw away. So if you throw away food and it winds up in the landfill, the way most does, especially if you're here in Santa Barbara, Goleta area, there is no composting. There is no public utility composting of food that we eat. So that food goes into landfills, and that's where it begins producing methane. That's why Peter Kalmus, if you remember, when he lists those 5 things that he does, the top was air travel, but he also had composting in there. Why does that matter? Well, if you take a significant chunk of the food, of the stuff that you're throwing away, which is food, and you compost that, you can actually create that, obviously, into compost that you can use, but it doesn't create the same kind of emissions, methane emissions and all. But it is an extraordinary thing to think about. So, we've talked about, we looked at the Wastemakers, that book, about the problem with making waste. Well, here it is in cold hard facts. That waste that you have is going. You only have a 2 metric ton allocation, and 1.3 metric tons is just the waste that you make. And the making waste is a huge problem. It can be helped, right? Things like composting, that's the easiest. Packaging, the kind of packaging things come in, maybe that can be recycled and all. But if you take this slide and the last one about how much, every dollar emits into the atmosphere, and then how much you throw away, you see where there's something to what Thoreau and the minimalists are saying, and that is consume less. Less you consume, less emissions to make the thing that you have, whether it's manufacturing or bringing it to you, and the less it creates a problem as it decomposes. So I just want to check here our next iClicker poll. And the reason I'm asking if you're caught up with the course readings, it's actually, I made it a question, but it's really imperative, a command: get caught up with your course readings, right? It's next Thursday, so don't try to do everything, Wednesday night. Here's an opportunity to get caught up. If you're not caught up, there's plenty of time if you're not caught up. So let's see how everyone is looking. It's a nice descending curve, isn't it? Most people are caught up, almost caught up. You're in good shape. If you're at that lower end at C or D, here's the chance. And again, plenty of time to do it, but make sure you do get caught up. So kind of a little prodding on my part. Oops, hold on. Okay. People are talking about how they're not caught up, but that's okay. But let's get back to it. So here's an important thing. Kalmus focuses on personal action, But in his chapter on collective action, it reveals he has a more holistic view of the situation. And if Peter Kalmus doesn't, again, come to English 24, and he came last year, we can ask him about that. And I can just tell you that when people asked him about it last time, I don't think he regrets writing this book and the film made from it, but he wants to think more about collective action now. He wants to encourage you more to do sorts of collective action, activism, even pretty, you might say, extreme activism. So when I talked to him, was it, I guess, the morning before he came, it was interesting because he said he knew that as a professor, I can't actually try to radicalize you. I can't tell you to go out and do, acts of climate activism. He said he realized that I couldn't do that, but he asked if it would be okay if he did. And the most extreme thing that he suggested is that when, say, either UCSB sports events, that they're getting national or a lot of media attention, that maybe someone could run out there with holding one or two people holding a banner, kind of trying to disrupt things. He said you might get in trouble, you might get arrested for that, but when people pushed him on it, he said his thinking is, any kind of activism that is worth its weight means risk. And Peter Kalmus and a friend of his actually did this at a conference. They ran out and they held a banner to disrupt the conference. And they realized that it could create problems. And in fact, Peter wasn't penalized for it, but the person, because NASA didn't take a hardcore position, but the person who did it with him lost their job. And Peter he also talked about when he's been doing more acts of activism where he went down to, forget the bank now, wasn't Chase? Might have been Chase, I don't know. But a bank in the LA area, he chained himself to the doors so that they couldn't open the bank to start business. And he got national attention. In fact, if you put in Peter Kalmus bank into your browser, you'll see a picture of it. Peter got very emotional. He's in tears at the end of it. It spread very quickly, that event. But he thought he might lose his job, and he had to have a long discussion with his partner about it beforehand. So he's all about collective activism. He always has been, but now he really wants to draw attention to it. So lest you think that the only way to handle something like the climate crisis is to do personal action, yeah, he's putting his mouth, he's acting to do that, but collective action is also clearly part of the strategy. And we're going to talk about that in terms of the book and the documentary too. He succinctly notes that, and again, I'm quoting him here, global warming is a market failure. Burning fossil fuels imposes huge costs on society that aren't included in the price of fuels, primarily by causing global warming and respiratory illness. It's crucial to fix this market failure because few of us will voluntarily stop burning fossil fuels in a society that still strongly rewards this behavior. So it's a market failure. Why? There are all sorts of consequences of emitting greenhouse gases. One that he mentions here we might forget is something like respiratory illness. That's a huge problem. But people who are doing it aren't getting any of those consequences. So in other words, if you emit CO2 in the atmosphere, you should have to pay for these consequences. It's causing damage. If you put pollution into your local stream because of the EPA in the United States, you have to pay for the damage, because that might affect people downstream. People can't drink their water. They have to go out and buy, bottled water and all. Who's going to pay for all that? Well, the person putting that in the system has to pay for it. There is nothing like that with respect to fossil fuels in the United States. That's why he's calling it a market failure. Still hear people talking. So what's the answer then? How do you correct this? And this, again, is not something individual. It's a larger issue. He takes up this question of activism, and he does it to balance his personal action. And we'll talk about how do you correct that in a minute? And let me quote him here. In this chapter, I presented my opinions as a human being, not as a scientist. Although my job is to do science, as a human being, I have as much right to respectfully express my opinions as anyone else. I've done so here in order to balance my emphasis on individual actions and emission reductions elsewhere in the book. So just to clarify that, he believes we need to make larger societal reductions in emissions, but individual action will be part of that. And as I've suggested in one of the pre-recorded lectures I have, you can kind of see that as being a harbinger of the future. In other words, Peter Kalmus is trying to work out how we can live rich, meaningful lives while having very low emissions. Let me jump to the next slide, though. The book and the documentary, Being the Change, focus on lifestyle changes. So you might think that, the sole contribution that Peter Kalmus is making is in lifestyle changes. But if he had done that, if that were his whole thing, he would have taken his energy and continuing to just make lifestyle changes. But instead, he wrote a book and then, went to a lot of trouble to have it made into a documentary in order to spread the word. And in that sense, we'll just jump to the next slide to underscore it. Peter Kalmus's principal form of activism, at least at the time of the book and the documentary, is communication. So whatever he and his family did is pretty minuscule among 8 billion people on the planet. But if it impacts the people who read the book and watch the documentary, and it may impact you, that will leverage it by a lot more. So in that sense, the big payout of what he's done is not through the individual action, but an act of communication to other people. They've reached many thousands, probably millions of people, really. I just don't know the numbers on it. And that is, if you think about it, because if you read the book and you watch the documentary, you say, well, that's all about personal action. He doesn't take up any of those other things that Ken talked about, like communication, activism, political change, and all. And yet he does, though. I just want to underscore it because communication is central to the project here. And he's also, in the process of communication, going to encourage these other sort of larger changes that have to be done. But I'm interested to hear what you think of his approach through personal action, as well as his underscoring the need for activism and communication. So I'm going to jump now to the class discussion part. And this is a long comment, so I'm going to read the first part and then jump to the next part. When Peter Kalmus admitted that one person's reduction of greenhouse gas emissions may feel like a small drop in a vast sea, I didn't really understand why it was so important for him to make these personal changes. So why make the changes if they're insignificant? Some people may ask, why make an effort when it won't make a difference or any meaningful difference? It won't move the needle at all. But I found Kalmus explained it perfectly. One, he finds joy and a deeper connection with people and the environment when producing less greenhouse gas emissions. Two, it aligns with his personal principles. Finally, he believes this really does help indirectly. I think Peter Kalmus is right. Showing others how much you care for the environment will probably inspire them to change. So in other words, it's not what you do, but it's the way through your actions you communicate to other people that might inspire them to change. Reading Kalmus's experiences makes making a sustainable lifestyle seems approachable and rewarding. He states that he spent $4,000 per year on goods and even the stuff he buys at Target, which is something I relate to. He shows us that we can still buy things we need and live sustainably. I also loved how Kalmus mentioned that his main food source comes from trading surpluses, freeganism, and growing his own food. As Kalmus states, a lot of the emissions of food comes from growing, processing, packaging, and distributing it. So I would love to expand my small garden one day to produce a lot of my own food. Yeah, it's a long comment, but I wanted to start with it because it really gets to the heart of being the change, as well as the question of what each of us can do to mitigate the climate crisis. And in fact, this comment really hints at the paradox here in being the change, because it highlights all sorts of personal actions, right? From going freegan to drying your clothes on a line, yet makes clear that these personal actions are, as this person notes, I'm quoting this person, like a drop of change in a vast sea. So why then going about doing them? If personal action just doesn't move the needle, why do it at all? As this person succinctly notes that paradox here, why make an effort when it won't make a difference? And that's the real question. If one person cannot make any significant change, even if you do everything that Peter Kalmus did, if it's not going to change the situation, the climate crisis is going to happen just as quickly and just as bad, regardless of anything that you can do. And even at the low end, like Peter Cardassian, and even at the high end, if you live a supersized influencer Cardassian lifestyle, that won't make a difference because it's just one person, so why make a difference? As this person notes, though, Peter Kalmus has a variety of answers to this, but he makes a shocking statement, I think, in the first chapter, and that is, and I'm quoting Peter Kalmus here, I reduced my personal CO2 emissions from 20 metric tons per year, that's about the US average, to under 2 tons per year. He reduced his emissions by tenfold. An amazing achievement. As amazing it is, it's not the really shocking part. After all, we can imagine making all sorts of sacrifices to dramatically reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but it all sounds pretty terrible. But the shocking part is, Peter Kalmus says, and I'm quoting him here, quote, overall, this hasn't been a sacrifice. It has made me happier. That's the startling thing, I think. It's not that any person in the US could do it, but that doing it would actually make for a better, happier life. As this person who made the comment, and I'm quoting them again, unfolds it, this is them talking about Peter Kalmus, quote, he finds joy and a deeper connection with people and the environment when producing less greenhouse gas emissions. In other words, so back to me. In other words, even without the tremendous gains for the Earth, its climate, all life on the planet, all other human beings and other beings in general, the change that Peter Kalmus made, according to Peter Kalmus, would be worth it because these aren't sacrifices. That's the mind twist that you have to do. They're not sacrifices. Rather, these are acts to produce a happier life. This is not how you make your life less, but how you make your life more. And the difficulty is, and this is why what Peter Kalmus is really putting out here is a total mindset change, because it runs counter to the beliefs that many or most people have, even if you've not given it much thought. And that is that the personal changes that we need to do, and by that, of course, I mean relatively wealthy people in relatively wealthy countries like the US, it will be deprivation, unhappiness, sacrifices. So Peter Kalmus is arguing that it's not. That's the wrong way of looking at it. That way of looking at it is probably the only conclusion you can draw coming out of consumerist society that tells you that you need to buy and have in order to be happy. But according to Peter Kalmus, you'll live happier, better lives without it. And that makes it, in my opinion, a real win-win. And we've already seen this with other things like win-win. So if you educate more girls and women, anyone with a uterus, that is going to be better for the planet. But obviously education, bringing education to girls whose education stops at the 5th grade or 8th grade, which it does across the planet, that's valuable in its own right. So, I mean, even if the environment wasn't even on the table, you should do it. But on the other hand, making the kind of changes that are needed when they can be win-win are so much better, because why wouldn't you want to provide education for young girls? Of course you would. Why wouldn't you want to be happier? Why wouldn't you want to live a more fulfilling life? Peter Kalmus argues, do it, but do it for the planet as well. He also makes it, deeply personal, which I think is why it resonates with folks. And in that sense, the climate crisis is an opportunity to do what Henry David Thoreau prodded us to do 170 years ago before the climate crisis ever occurred, which is, if you remember Thoreau, his whole injunction, simplify, simplify, was to radically rethink our lives with the hope of making them more meaningful and simply better. Peter Kalmus took up Thoreau's challenge and did that. And his report back is that Thoreau was right. It made for a better life. Didn't seem like it would. It seems counter to everything that we've ever been told or inculcated to believe with consumer society. And as a consequence, Peter Kalmus provides this example for us of, how you could make systemic change that would ultimately lead to personal transformation. And not only includes wealthy countries, but everyone. The new version of the American dream that's been so problematic could come about. And in this sense, why would you want to do this? Would it be for yourself? Sure, but for everyone on the planet. So on the one hand, people like in the US who are, caught up in consumer society and it's making them unhappy, that's a great thing to do. On the other hand, people across the planet who need to have, basic needs net, like, fresh water and all that too, if we can come up with a sustainable way of life that everyone on the planet could live, wouldn't that be amazing? And wouldn't it be amazing if it wasn't deprivation and sacrifice, but a better life? It's his argument. The next one. Peter Kalmus, in Being the Change, attempts to uncover the importance of individual action. Peter Kalmus decided to change his lifestyle for the sake of his children. He wanted a better world for them. It's important to note that is his big part of his motivation. As you saw in the documentary, he has 2 boys. Climate change is affecting all life on the planet. Kalmus wants his children to experience life on Earth without the worry of an end. Kalmus has a philosophy he follows, which involves the head, the hands, and the heart. The head is for realizing from an intellectual, scientific point of view that there is a problem. Once the problem is recognized, we can take action with our hands. The hands are used for gardening, fixing old objects, riding a bike, and so forth. So the hands are like physical action, acting on knowledge. Knowledge is just this thing in your head until you do something with it. That's what the hands are for. So you go from head to hands. But the heart ties the head and the hands together. The heart is where meaning is found in making life more satisfying. In conclusion, taking part in environmentally friendly things equals a happier, more meaningful life. Yeah, another super perceptive comment, and focusing on these 3 things that Peter Kalmus focuses on: the head, the hands, and the heart. And it's a very kind of poetic way of thinking about it. And you can see Peter Kalmus is not wanting to come across just as a, hardcore fact-only scientist. There's more to him than that. So he's looking beyond his own life, Peter Kalmus, to the future. And I think that's something it's important to note. If you remember, I have this, I think it's last week. Oh, by the way, little housekeeping thing. There is no additional, or are no additional documentaries to watch this week. If you go to week number 9, you won't see any. That's to give you room to start preparing to catch up. So either catch up if you're not catch up, or you could start reviewing if you are, to get ready for the final exam. But if you remember from last week, I have that small lecture series on climate and generation, in which I argue that one of the fundamental challenges with the climate crisis is it requires to think beyond a single generation. That is what we knew we had to do before you as a generation got here, but that we didn't do. But to Peter Kalmus, better late than never, right now for parents everywhere, and in part he is talking to parents or people that may want to have children, this is yet another impetus to do so. So the great irony, the great injustice of it all, right, from a generational level, is that the generation that did most of the problem, my generation, people older like Donald Trump and Joe Biden in particular, they caused all the problems. They created the climate crisis. They put during their watch, 85 to 90% of greenhouse gas emissions were put up in the atmosphere, and yet they will die before any of the big consequences come. Your generation will have another 80 years or more. Most of the consequences will be delayed, time delayed, so that you have to experience them. Again, a huge justice problem. So we could talk about these 3 things in a little detail, just since the person brought them up. I'm going to quote Peter Kalmus here when he's talking about the head. So this person did a great job of summing it up, but let me let me allow Peter Kalmus to flesh it out a little more. So quoting him, one is intellectual understanding the head. The head allows me to prioritize. It helps me navigate to my goals, although I find it's not always good at choosing those goals. One of the lessons I've learned is that I'm not limited in time, energy, and ability. If I'm to make any progress, I need to choose my path. Oh, I am limited. I need to choose my path wisely. This means making the right decisions, gathering information about reality as it is, which is often very different than how it appears to be or how I want it to be, and drawing conclusions objectively. The head is a scientist. So what is the head about? What's the role of intellect here, of fact gathering, of reading, of thinking, of talking with other people? Because you have limited time, energy, and ability, as he notes, you need to prioritize. You need to figure out how your time can best be spent, how you can get the most done, how you get the most bang for the buck. I mean, an easy thing for him would be changing those appliances that had those pilot lights, sure, but you need to think about that. And also, not just for the one-win goal of being good for the climate, but the win-win for making your life better. So, before you can do anything and before you can go out and just start doing things, think about and prioritize what you're doing. So I'm going to quote him again. And by the way, these are all on the lecture notes, the PDF on the course website. The second part, and this is Peter Kalmus, of my path is practical action, the hands. As we'll see, society's business as usual trajectory is carrying us toward disaster. If we wish to avoid disaster, we must take action. In other words, just don't think about it. We need to roll up our hands and do things. Since I can't change the entire global trajectory single-handedly, I perform practical and local actions, changing myself and how I live right here, right now. Direct personal action is empowering. It brings measurable, tangible change. It's fun, and therefore I can sustain it easily. It provides its own guidance. Time and time again, I found that only by taking a step, making some actual change, is the next step revealed. I find that all the planning and intellectualizing in the world can't substitute for doing something. There's wisdom in doing. That's a fascinating comment. So, if you just had it, right, that adage I've talked about in the previous lecture, knowledge is power. Yeah, knowledge is not power. Knowledge is just knowledge. You have to act on it to become power. Knowledge is nothing if not acted on. It's actually opportunities lost if you don't act on it. But Peter Kalmus says acting on it, it has a cyclical thing. It generates more knowledge too. He calls it wisdom here, because the more you do, the more you learn about what you're doing. And by the way, when he's talking about things, there's things like here, like gardening in his backyard. Takes knowledge to learn how to do it, but the more you do it, the more you learn about it. You learn from the process itself. You learn from the process of making things yourself, how that changes the world, because it changes you in the process. And he notes finally, as this person nicely summed up, the heart is the third part of his trilogy here. So we just talked about the head, the hands, and now the heart. This is Peter Kalmus. He notes that the third part of my path is seeing from the heart. The third part is what connects me to myself, to other people, and to nature. Without it, action can become compulsive and joyless. Connection brings purpose and meaning to thought and action. I have a specific and concrete practice for this third part. This is his action. How do you do it? He says, quote, I meditate by observing my body and mind in a particular way. Meditation allows me to be joyful most of the time, even when studying global warming every day at work. Meditation helps me connect to the sea of everyday miracles around me, the plants growing, the sun shining, my older son loving putting his arm around his brother's shoulder. I find great strength in this awareness. So what is the heart? That's what connects you to all this, not intellectually, not through action, but to use a word, spiritually connects you to other people, and this what adds joy to the whole thing. And bring it all together, Peter Kalmus says that, quote, these three parts support and balance one another in shaping a response to our predicament. Each part is important. Yeah, so it's not enough that you figure out what to do. It's not enough that you act on that knowledge. That's the head and the hands. But you have to connect up with yourself and with other people. And that's where you find meaning. And keep in mind that that's very different than consumer culture. You can't buy that, right? You can only, immerse yourself in the world by immersing yourself in the world, being with other people, being out in nature, being with animals, being with pets. All those things can bring you meaning, but we don't do it, even to the point, and Peter Kalmus underscores this, of connecting up with yourself. And, meditation is what he argues is a way to do it, to just stop and think about what's meaningful and important in life. So next comment is a two-parter. So I'll read the first part and then I'll go on. I want to focus on one particular subject you have mentioned, which is Peter Kalmus's proposal of a carbon fee. That's good because we need to talk about that. Personally, I believe it's a great measure, but by no means perfect. For example, people may still choose to buy tax products if the corporations advertise them as being necessary to people. And to cut the cost imposed by taxes, corporations might choose to cut costs in other ways, such as choosing cheaper labor and resources, which is usually not a good thing. It's obvious that for the carbon fee to work most efficiently, corporation behavior needs to be strictly regulated. That's right. And the public needs to be more clearly informed about the environmental cost of each product. But even if the carbon fee has problems, it's still the best plan for now. By the way, I think that's right. As Kalmus has said in the book, he is walking a middle path, and a carbon fee would be the next first step. It has been proven effective in smaller scales, such as examples of British Columbia, mentioned in the book, and mentioned other places too, like Denmark, and not mentioned in the book, places like Denmark and all. But clearly, to impose it on a larger scale on the entire United States, there's still more work to be done from the individual level way up to the government. So it's a really good comment and worth pausing and talking about what a carbon fee is like. So here's the problem. At the risk of stating kind of the obvious, one of the difficulties with voluntary action is that it's voluntary. You have to opt in. So everything that Peter Kalmus is urging you to do, you may not opt into any of it. You may not care about it. Fine. Maybe you do. You may find the idea of slow travel intriguing and appealing. However, many people, if you even mention slow travel, and we'll get to that with another comment if we have time, even mentioned it, people say slow travel is ludicrous, Why would you do it? How then do you convince people to adopt something like slow travel and to swear off of air travel? How do you do it, especially given that for 400 years, we've had a culture that has sort of fetishized travel and talked about the importance of travel. And if you remember if you're in English 22, and if you remember going back to the Renaissance, to like 16th century, it became the way that every cultivated person would do. Principally, all wealthy white young men in Europe, they're wealthy enough, would travel around Europe on something called the Grand Tour, and that was considered part of your education. To learn about the world, about yourself, you were supposed to travel. That has continued on today, and that's continually sold to us by like the travel industry. The travel was somehow important for education. But anyhow, how do you counter that? How do you, bring something in, like a new way of thinking about travel, like slow travel? This is where a carbon fee or a carbon tax comes into play. And if you remember, Peter Kalmus is particularly focusing on a carbon fee and not a tax. As I noted in the lecture I had on air travel, on a personal level, there's no way in a shorter period of time to emit more greenhouse gases than by hopping on an airplane. You just can't do it. But a carbon fee is tailor-made to address that problem. How it works is every time you produce something that can produce greenhouse gases, a tax has to be put on it. So with fossil fuels, every time a company pumps oil out of the ground, digs coal out of the ground, vents natural gas, methane out of the ground, they have to pay a tax on that they're selling it. So a barrel of oil will become more expensive because a fee or a tax will be associated with it. How does that impact air travel or any kind of travel? Well, that oil gets made into gasoline or jet fuel. that now carries an increased cost because that fee was levied for it. So what that means is a cost of a gallon of gasoline is going to go up. Why? Because that fee has been extracted from that. And it means that, air travel would go up a lot because air travel is the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases for a short period of time. How much? Well, if you do the math and people have, let's say right now you could go and find a cheap flight online from LAX to New York and back, a round trip flight. I don't really know what that costs, but let's say it's $500 because that's the number people have looked at. Once you start putting a fee in, you would start increasing it slowly or quickly. We should have been doing this for the last 30 years, like Denmark, but you would start increasing it to the point where that cost is enough to cover all the damages you're doing. And what kind of damages? All sorts of damages, from wildfires to floods to everything. What would that be? Well, that $500 ticket is going up to ultimately about $5,500. That's what a fee would do. Now, how many people would continue flying as much as they do if the cost of flying increased tenfold? It's not a voluntary buy-in. Anytime you buy a ticket, you would have to pay for that. Similarly, anytime you get in a car, if the price of gasoline goes up tenfold, then, it's instead of $4 a gallon or $5, whatever it is now, to $40 or $50, that would dramatically increase it. And what it would mean is, since we're talking about transportation, let's stay on it. What would people do? They would look for less expensive options, right? If you could do it. Because electric buses and electric trains can be powered by renewables, by, photovoltaics or wind turbines or whatever, the cost of those would not go up. And in fact, depending on how you use that carbon fee, could go down. So in other words, if if the fee derived from air travel, that increase from 500, ultimately 5,500, were to use to create high-speed rail, then you would probably take high-speed rail because the cost of that would go down a lot. So in other words, let's say I've used the example before, you're going from LAX to Chicago, 2,000 miles. Well, plane gets there very quickly, but high-speed rail would get you there in 10 hours. The difference would be that plane ticket would be thousands of dollars because it's being subsidized by a carbon fee. That ticket to go to Chicago on a high-speed rail, that 10-hour trip, might be $50. That would be the difference. It would subsidize everything. So, right, traveling by bicycle is impractical now in a lot of places, but imagine all the fees that you're getting from, automobiles and all, if that were being flipped into more bicycle infrastructure, really good mass transit and all, that would make a difference. And none of those things, all those things would go down. So if you're worried about, and you have to address this as a social justice issue, because there are going to be people that are immediately hurt by it. So people that don't, so if you look statistically at how much people pay for energy in the United States, the less money you have, the larger percentage you pay. So in other words, if you have a family income of like $40,000, you're paying a significant chunk for energy. You're paying it because you might have a couple cars with gasoline. You might have a heater that requires oil or natural gas, and it could be like 20% of your total money you have available. If you're making not 40,000 but 400,000 a year, it's probably nowhere near 20%. It's just a lot smaller. So what a carbon fee would do would be to help subsidize people making a transition away from it by doing things like, reducing the cost of solar so you could put it on your rooftop so that, you would be able to use an electric bicycle or something like that. So the big goal here is, though, and this is why Peter Kalmus is so big on it, everyone would gravitate towards more environmentally climate-friendly options, regardless of whether it involves travel, housing, food, clothing, and so forth. You wouldn't have to opt in, it would just happen that way. So shifting away from transportation, let's talk about food systems. Well, beef would become more and more expensive. Why? Because so many greenhouse gases, methane, are emitted during the production of it. So now, I don't know what beef costs, like hamburger might cost you $5 a pound or something. It'll gradually go up to $30, $40 or more a pound. And at the same time, the cost of other things would go down. So lentils are already incredibly cheap, but you'd have all sorts of products in the supermarket made from them, and it would be so much less expensive. And people, again, might not choose this. They may not be Peter Kalmus right now making these choices, but everyone would naturally gravitate towards those choices. And as this comment notes, though, there are all sorts of challenges to implementing a carbon tax, to getting it worked out. But the first thing, and this comes back to the thing about voting, you need to put people in office like, AOC and all, who are fully promoting making to pricing carbon. I mean, that's the thing you have to do first. Next comment. A similarity I saw between Ken's lectures and from this chapter is reduced flying because of its huge impact. In addition, Kalmus provides good reason why he prefers slow travel that I think are underappreciated in our lifestyles now. He says that slow travel allows them to connect with local communities more than while having more of an adventure. He also notes that flying can spread diseases in a pandemic like we've witnessed with the coronavirus. Yeah. So in that little lecture I have on why flying is the worst thing you can do, I introduced the idea of slow travel. Peter Kalmus introduces this with a wonderful quote by the Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh. And here's Hanh's quote: "The miracle is not to walk on water. The miracle is to walk on the green earth, just to walk, to get around." In other words, and Thich Nhat Hanh is a big proponent, as many Buddhists are, of walking meditation. Walking slowly through a place rather than flying over at 3/4 of the speed of sound, 8 miles high, but walking through it, moving through it slowly, like on a bicycle too, gives you an opportunity to see just how wonderful and miraculous it is. It's something you would never get from flying above it. Kalmus's chapter on slow travel, which, like the rest of the book you can read online, is interesting chapter, and it's a fun read. For example, he recounts how he hitched a ride on a cargo ship from the port of Los Angeles going to Honolulu. So instead of flying to Honolulu, the cargo ship was traveling there anyhow. And he talks to the chief engineer, and he runs the numbers and finds out that his emissions were less than 1% of the emissions had he flown, that there would be other ways of doing it. And as this person notes, the last thing about the pandemic, Peter Kalmus notes that modern air travel is the ideal way for a local outbreak to spread into a pandemic. We don't usually equate air travel with COVID-19 as a global epidemic, but when there were new variants appearing all the time, like there was the Delta and then the Omicron variant and all, you used to hear statements like, the Delta variant is now in whatever country because a traveler had traveled there. It spread, all the variants spread completely around the globe very, very quickly because of the way we rely on air travel. So one long comment, I split into two again. While I was reading the chapters on being the change, I read something so pertinent that I stopped reading and put it in my journal. Kalmus writes, "If you choose flying, go forth and fly, but please don't pretend your life is sustainable." Ever since learning about this is the person continuing, ever since learning about the extreme climate impact of air travel, it's felt like forbidden information. I didn't know how much GHG emissions I was directly responsible for when I traveled via plane. I wouldn't, if I didn't know, then I wouldn't feel so incredibly guilty about it. One of my number one goals in life is to travel. In my dream life, I'd never be sedentary. I'd be constantly nomadic, jetting off to a new place every month. Kalmus highlights the importance of personal action, and for my entire adult life, I've agreed and tried to live as sustainably as I can. So continuing. But then he really punches me in the gut. He tells me that if I fly, then I can't consider my life environmentally sustainable. He's right, and Ken is right, and flying frequently isn't a goal I should aspire to. Maybe it's time to rethink my life goals. Maybe instead of visiting a new place every month, my dream life consists of living smack dab in the middle of every continent for 5 years at a time. Then I only take a plane once every 5 years. By the way, you can move around the continents without taking a plane most of the time, by the way, South America, North America, anyhow, and of course, all through Asia, Africa, and Europe. That sounds really cool. This is the major theme I take away from the reading. In the future, I can make choices that challenge cultural aspirations, but still lead to a fulfilling life, perhaps even more so than the status quo. I want to live like Peter Kalmus. He seems to have the most. He seems happier than most, and he's actually making a difference in the world. I don't want to become someone that says that they care about the planet and then knowingly takes such selfless actions that harm it. I want to be the change. Yeah, another absolutely terrific comment. So, by the way, comments like that, just as an aside, underscore why I put these comments here, because I think there's so much to be learned about from you rather than just from me. So anyhow, and I would note, by the way, that I mentioned that I haven't flown, but I do intend to travel in like 2 or 3 years because I have a young daughter and I have a sabbatical come up, and I'd love the idea of maybe once a decade doing that because I haven't flown for almost a decade, and I think that would be fine. I mean, if you think about it, you would dramatically cut your carbon budget. If you did something like that. And if my daughter, maybe she'll be 10 when we do that, maybe 10 years later, she'll take a gap year somewhere between or after college, and then she could travel someplace too for a while, for like a year. And yeah, anyhow, let me jump, because I could talk more about that, but let me jump to, actually, let me go back. Hold on. Whoops. Don't take the iClicker poll. I'm not doing that yet. Okay. Let me jump to the next comment. No, wait, sorry, I'm a little mixed up. I will figure it out. Yeah. If you think about, I'm going to continue a little more with this comment, and then I want to get to the next one. But don't worry, we'll leave it a little early today. If you think about this comment, it's so good because this person, in reducing travel that much instead of every month, has come up with a way of still traveling, but dramatically reducing GHG emissions. And it's utterly simple. Sure, you can still travel. Let's say you travel 1/10 as much, well, then your greenhouse gas emissions are 1/10 as much. That will rely, however, on more slow travel. So if this person takes up this plan to, living right in the middle of a continent for 5 years, there's going to be a lot of travel around, and with more renewables coming online, renewable buses, train, that's possible. But you may know, and if you go online, you can find the stories of all sorts of people like this. People have traveled around the world by walking, and people have traveled around the world by bicycle, and bicycling is a thing, actually. And that's sort of the either of those things are sort of the apex of what slow travel is. Slow travel is when, instead of 5 cities in 5 days via air or whatever, that you spend the time getting to know people along the way. That's your project of getting to know people and see things along the way. And it takes time, of course, but it's the parallel is with fast food and slow food. Fast food, sure, you can go to McDonald's and you can order and eat your food and be out of there in 15 minutes. Slow food is just the opposite, and slow food might seem paradoxical to someone in a fast food mindset, right? If you can do it all in 15 minutes, why would you spend all day cooking? Why would you do that? Why would you spend time gardening and all to produce the food that you cook? The slow food movement has taken the position that, well, it's better. Not only is the food better for you, that's a given, but the process of doing it, being, with friends, cooking a meal, sharing a meal with friends, having contributed to some of the food for making the meal by way of gardening, it's just so much better. If you think about it, it just doesn't make any sense. Sure, if you're like absolute efficiency, fast food makes sense. But if you can come up with a lifestyle where you can do things like, slow food, it's so much better. And traveling, if you can do things like slow travel, it's absolutely better. And by the way, it doesn't cost you anything. So Henry David Thoreau, you didn't read all of Walden, but at one point in Walden, I don't think this is what you read, he actually takes up an argument that if he travels somewhere, the best way to do it is to walk there. And why he says that is because at the time there were trains. If you remember passing Walden Pond, there was a commuter rail, which is still there, that goes into Boston. Well, these things cost money, and at the time they cost more because we didn't have things like fast travel that's producing all these emissions that's not being accounted for. So he argued, if you take the time to go work somewhere to make the money to travel, his argument was, well, don't do that, just start walking. You can go there and it'll be that much less, it will not cost you any more money because you're just walking, and the time that you have walking there will be far more valuable and better than if you had taken a train to go there. Certainly if you had taken a plane, you actually get to see the place. Yeah. And what this person suggests does sound as they put here. So I'll quote them again. Maybe it's time to rethink my life choices. Maybe instead of visiting a far off new place every month, my dream life consists of living smack dab in the middle of every continent for 5 years. Yeah, and I think that's exactly what Peter Kalmus is suggesting doing. So last time Peter came here, I may have mentioned he came up on the bus on the train, and he brought his bike with him. So we biked around Santa Barbara when he was here. This reading and the film, Being the Change, shows how everyday people can change their habits and practices in order to help the planet. I thought it was interesting to see how to calculate my footprint, although I'm terrible at math and have not been keeping track of how many miles I drive, how many times my family does laundry in a month, etc. Websites that show you the carbon footprint are really helpful in that regard. Yes, they are. So, spoiler for next week, what you're going to be doing is actually, I have a link to a carbon footprint calculator, and it's a pretty good one, and it'll allow you to do very precise calculations of everything. So for example, food, which we've talked about a lot, it'll give you the option. If you eat a lot of beef, if you eat pork, if you eat chicken, if you're largely plant-based, if you're a vegetarian, if you're a vegan, it gives you the ability to tease all that out. So you can't really do it as accurately as Peter Kalmus did, because there are things it doesn't calculate, but it's pretty good. So if you're curious about what you are doing individually, and by the way, it will immediately spot if you have issues. So in other words, if you fly a lot, if you're like doing that, it'll show you exactly how much that does. And you may have seen these calculators before. It'll tell you not just in like metric tons and all, which is good, but it's kind of just a number. But it'll tell you what it would mean if everyone on the planet did the same. Now we have 8 billion people. What if 8 billion people did the same as you? And it'll tell you that, you may have seen these before, not in pounds, but how many Earths would be necessary to live a lifestyle like yours. And then the challenge will be to do what Peter Kalmus did, is to bring it down so that we could all live sustainably on one Earth. And he did that. It'll be kind of curious. I think you'll find it interesting when you do it as well. So let me jump. Okay, just another check, something for you to think about if you're caught up with the course films and documentaries. If not, you have until next Thursday to do so. Oh, glad to see people are caught up or nearly caught up. Okay, see you on Thursday.